I'll now introduce the session. Firstly, thank you to everyone for attending the 2022 Arts Leadership and Advocacy Seminar, a program of WestAF. This is our first session for this two-day event. And this session will focus on the national and federal policy landscape. I will hand over in a moment to my colleague, Nejin Lee at the League of American Orchestras, who's moderating this session. Just a couple of reminders. Please remain muted and with your webcam disabled during the session. This is for our attendees as a reminder. Also, feel free to use the chat and Q&A features to interact with the panel and to pose questions. If you have anything that comes up or you're experiencing anything and you need some support, please also use the chat to let us know. All right, and with that, I will hand over to Nejin. Again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. So under the umbrella of the federal policy landscape, we'll be covering a number of topics today, including ways in which the arts and cultural sector has mobilized in new ways that has led to unprecedented advocacy efforts, the increased interest that we've seen from federal lawmakers in working on legislation that supports the field, ways in which the pandemic changed the arts policy landscape, and some major themes that are emerging in legislation and more. So we're hoping to cover quite a bit today, but we will be leaving time at the end for questions. So first, we're going to do a lightning round of introductions. As David said, I'm Nejin Lee. I'm pulling double duty as a moderator as well as a panelist for this session. I'm the Director of Government Affairs and Education Advocacy at the League of American Orchestras. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a middle-aged Asian American woman. I'm joining you today from Northern Virginia, the land of the Manahoac. I'll pass it to Tony, then I'll ask Ryan and then Crystal for their quick intros.
Thank you, Nejin. My name is Tony Shivers, Director of Government Affairs for Opera America and Dance USA. Opera America is based in New York. Dance USA is based in Washington, D.C. Both are national service organizations representing the opera community and dance communities respectfully. I'm coming to you live from Northern Virginia, about 5 minutes away from Dulles Airport, about 32 miles west of Washington, D.C. My pronouns are he, him. I am wearing a blue and white collared dress shirt with a black tie. I am an African-American male of Native American descent. I'm also wearing glasses and I have a black and white goatee. I am also coming to you from the ancestral lands of the Manahoac in Herndon, Virginia. And I'll pass it off to my to my colleague.
Ryan, would you like to go next?
Oh, yes, I'm next. Thanks. Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Stubbs. I am the Senior Director of Research at the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, or NASA. I use he, his, him pronouns, and I am a white man with glasses, short hair, and a short beard. And I'm coming to you today from what is colonially known as Denver, Colorado, which is on the traditional lands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute peoples. And I will pass it to Crystal.
Hi, everybody. My name is Crystal Young. I'm the Executive Director of Utah Cultural Alliance. I use she, her pronouns. I am middle-aged, blonde, and blue-eyed, and today my hair is curly. It changes. And I am joining you today from the beautiful state, Salt Lake City, Utah, which is the ancestral lands of the Ute, Diné, Navajo, Paiute, Goshute, and Shoshone tribes. I'm happy to be here.
Great. So we're all going to start with essentially the same prompt right now, which is what are the key advocacy priorities for the constituents you serve? And sort of a joining follow on to that would be, why should your constituents care about the federal landscape? So we'll go in the same order for this round. I'll just kick off. Like many national service organizations, I would say that we work on a range of federal policy issues. So this includes things you would likely expect, such as annual appropriations for the cultural agencies. But we're also very heavily involved in tax policy, particularly charitable giving, as it's such a significant part of the operating budget for nonprofit arts organizations. For example, we know that on average before COVID, 40% of financial support for orchestras was derived from private contributions. We know that in the last 2 years, for many, that percentage has been even higher. In addition to that, I would say music education, visa policies for engaging international guest artists, and both international and domestic rules regarding travel with musical instruments are really big areas of concern for our constituents. They should care about federal landscape issues like these because this affects their survival when it comes to the tax policy grants that they could get from appropriations, and as well as it affects their daily operations and what they can offer to the public for these other issues. Tony, would you like to go next, please?
Thanks, Nejin, and I appreciate to you for moderating this session, and to my panelists for being with us. So all those issues, Dance USA and Opera America, the opera communities and dance communities all track those as well. I know we're also very interested in and engaged in tax policy as well. There's been, as a result of the pandemic support legislation that has been passed over the last couple of years, there were some increased federal incentives for charitable giving. And so that has benefited our the dance community and opera community across the country for those that are not historically providing charitable contributions, but are able to provide those and do not have to, and they don't historically itemize, being able to do so easily. And again, our communities both benefited from that. And there's also, particularly for the opera community, visa processing issues are particularly important for us, for them to be able to plan ahead for their performances and to ensure that they have the performers that they need for these specific performances. They need to really plan well ahead to work with the U.S. Department of State and U.S. Department of Homeland Security to ensure that those international artists that they want to secure are able to come stateside in a timely manner. And so those the issues that you raised, Nejin, and then additionally the issues that I just indicated are all important issues for us. And then not only that, but providing greater access to arts education programs to our nation's students, particularly important at a young age, and to foster and their creativity. Particularly important that we ensure that they have access to a variety of arts education programs that's available. And so all those issues are important to us.
Great. Ryan, same prompt to you. What are the key advocacy priorities for NASA, and why should your constituents care about the federal landscape?
Sure. So I imagine a lot of people that are joining us today are familiar with state arts agencies and maybe with NASA. So I'll start with just giving a little bit of a background of who we are and what we do, and then talk about how that relates to our federal priorities. But so first, I work remotely in Denver, but NASA is a DC-based professional association, and they work on behalf of, or we work on behalf of the nation's 56 state arts agencies. So that's every state plus 6 jurisdictions, including DC, Guam, Puerto Rico, American Samoa, Northern Marianas Islands, and the Virgin Islands. And all of these states and jurisdictions have publicly funded agencies that support the arts. And so NASA's role is as a not-for-profit, nonpartisan organization that champions public support and support for those agencies. And we support those agencies in many ways, but the 3 tenets of our work are really representation of state arts agencies and their policy interests at the state and federal levels. And our CEO, Pam Breaux, and our legislative counsel, Isaac Brown, leads the way on lots of those advocacy efforts on Capitol Hill. But we also build community among the agencies across the country through convening. And my role really is through our knowledge services and leading our knowledge services. So that's all of the research that we do to understand state arts agency funding, grant making, and the varied services and programs being implemented by state arts agencies. And so this is an interesting space because it's part of supporting the vital public agency infrastructure in the USA. And we get to work with a wide variety of agencies, all of which have the challenges of serving the entire population of their states, all have different political environments, and all are innovating in different ways to meet local challenges. And the role of NASA and state arts agencies is especially important because in the federal advocacy realm, because Congress mandates that 40% of the NEA's program budget goes to state arts agencies and regional arts organizations. So we work closely with our partners in the NEA, and we often make the point that investments in the NEA have a much greater reach because of the state and federal partnership in the arts, and because those federal funds are matched at the local levels and the state levels and create more opportunities for more artists. NEA funding is obviously a huge priority for NASA because states benefit from that, but many others benefit from that as well. And I think there's a number of reasons for this aside. There's a number of reasons for NEA funding to be a priority aside from more dollars going to more states. So one is that the federal and state partnership makes the value of the arts and the arts endowment highly relevant to more organizations and more visible to the broader public. And also many state arts agencies give smaller awards that for organizations that may not be able to compete for NEA funding. So NEA funding is the large policy issue that's important to our constituents that I'll probably say again and again, but just to touch on a few other things, the integration and support of the arts in federal relief efforts is a priority. Promoting federal interagency collaborations that include the arts is another thing. Growing resources for arts education within the Department of Education, and facilitating community healing, especially for populations disproportionately hurt by the pandemic. And I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. Crystal, as someone from the Utah Cultural Alliance, you're representing a different organization type than the rest of us here. Could you say a little bit about the UCA, what your top advocacy priorities are, and if time permits, maybe a little bit about why a state org follows federal policy, what that significance of the connection is?
Absolutely. I am a little bit the fish out of water, but also, we've been having these what's federal, what's state for the 250 years of our country. And so I think it's kind of interesting to bring that lens to this discussion. But so Utah Cultural Alliance is the industry association for arts, culture, and entertainment in the state of Utah. And I'll just lead by saying, as many of y'all listening know, one of my soapboxes is we're an industry and not a cause. It's a bit of a different seat at the table when we use that lens with our advocacy and policy making work. We care about federal policy because federal policy is an intimate part of everything that happens on a state level and influences what happens on a state level, and state policy and national politics influence the tenor and conversation of our politics here as well in the state of Utah. We have a small delegation, but one of our senators is a swing vote in the Senate, and one of the members of our House serves on Interior Appropriations. And so a big bulk of our work as a state level industry association is, I feel like it's our job to make whatever number of federal representation we have be advocates, be champions for this industry. And so it's our job to relationship build with them, to be the ones who can call them when there's a bill that needs a little bit of nuance and they're the one who can do that, or work on money and they're the one who can do that. And I feel like we've made a lot of progress over the years, especially with those two. And who knows, we have a competitive Senate race for the first time ever in the general election. So we might even have 2 swing votes in the Senate, you never know. some of the issues we care about the most, of course, are public investment. As we like to say here at Utah, fiscally responsible public investment, but a lot of public investment to help sustain our industry and the nonprofit side of our industry. We care a lot about arts education, cultural education, and even though a lot of that is state level policy, there is federal investment that comes. That's part of that we care about. We've done a lot with ticketing fraud over time because we are an industry association that serves the for-profit and nonprofit sides of our industry. It's important for us to work on regulatory issues that affect all sides of our business models. And ticketing fraud is one of those issues that impact for-profit and for-profit cultural businesses the same. And it really is a state-by-state issue. And a federal issue that needs to be addressed with federal regulation. And so that's something that we care about. Other things that we've always cared about over time too that impact the national landscape, I think, is one of the things I've talked about with my colleagues over time is the importance of code switching to make sure that we truly are nonpartisan when we talk about this industry. Those of us in red states are successful too, and we can do it by using the right words that translate across the aisle, and so that's something that we've cared about a lot too on these national conversations.
Thanks. So actually kind of building on what some of your remarks just included, when you talk about, it's important for the states to follow what's happening at the federal level. Our next question talks about the proliferation of arts advocacy coalitions and efforts at the federal level over the last 2 years. So I'm going to ask a couple of us to talk about how to describe the changes we're seeing and what you all think that means for our effectiveness as a field moving forward. So I was going to start off by talking about the growth of an ad hoc coalition that my organization has been in for a long time. And I will actually very quickly loop back to the point I was going to make about how this connects to what you said. So the Cultural Advocacy Group, as I said, the League of American Orchestras, as well as many other national service organizations, have been part of this group that has met monthly for a long time. And what has been particularly interesting is that in recent months, but I would say really since the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've actually seen a number of state groups join our coalition, and even a few locals. And while the focus of our conversations remain primarily on federal level advocacy, and from a practical standpoint, that has a lot to do with we just don't have the capacity to register as lobbyists at the state level. Every state has its own very unique set of triggers, and it can be very costly to register at the state level. So at least speaking for my organization, we try to sort of keep an eye on what's happening, but we don't actually engage in state level lobbying. But it's been really informative to hear from some of the state members that have joined our coalition to talk about how this policy translates, and also just to really get a better sense of the whole vertical interaction. So local, state, federal, we've always sort of known that all of these levels interact and policy trickles down, but it also trickles back up. And when we craft issue briefs every year, for example, we are often looking for state and local examples to help illustrate whether it's an example of a grant that has been going to good use and can be very helpful for dissemination purposes, or just talking strategically about how we appeal to certain champions or people that we want to co-sign onto legislation. It's extremely helpful to know what's going on at the state and local level, what particular examples of good work is happening, or conversely, trouble that's happening. So I would just, I was really just going to mention that particular ad hoc coalition definitely has seen this evolution of additional organizations, and it's broadened our view, as I said, on the policies we monitor and how we envision the role of arts and other dimensions that intersect with the arts. Tony, would you like to say a word about this as well, perhaps as it relates to shuttered venues, a little program that I think a lot of people probably know something about?
Yeah, Megan, thanks for that. Opera America and Dance USA, we heavily rely on our relationships and our partners, not only across the arts and cultural sector, but across the business community and nonprofit sector. A key takeaway for you all is that advocacy is important and advocacy works. And advocacy is just a small but important part of civic engagement, right? Being able, the individual and collective actions to improve the lives of our community. Just take funding, for example. The sectors, our involvement, the arts and cultural sector, business community, nonprofit sector, they advocate just for funding. They were instrumental in passing 6 major pieces of legislation since March of 2020, totaling close to $6 trillion. This is including the $6 trillion, close to $6 trillion includes $135 million in emergency funding for the National Endowment for the Arts, and $135 million in emergency funding for the National Endowment for the Humanities. Remember the extension of federal unemployment benefits for those creative workers that are not routinely eligible for unemployment benefits, those sole proprietors, those independent contractors. That was a result of the pandemic relief legislation over the last couple of years. The suspension of student loan payments, being able to address the homeless crisis, the establishment, as Nejin indicated, the establishment of the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant Program, the $16 billion program, Paycheck Protection Program, the Employee Retention Tax Credit Program. And so these are a whole host of federal pandemic support programs that were enacted by Congress through the advocacy efforts of a variety of coalitions that my organizations and the organizations of my panelists have been involved in. And so these coalitions, these collaborative advocacy efforts are extremely important. And another example that kind of led to the establishment, particularly of the Shuttered Venue Operators Grant Program, was the National Independent Venues Association. Our organization has collaborated with, the acronym is NEVA. These are mostly, for the most part, for-profit live venues, but they also have nonprofit venues as well. They were established, NEVA was established as a result of the pandemic, and there needed to be a greater voice to ensure support during this pandemic. And so, kind of going back and wrapping up, our involvement in a variety of coalitions is pretty extensive. We can mention, I'll talk about the Performing Arts Alliance later on in this discussion, but there's a whole host of coalitions and collaborative advocacy efforts across a variety of issues.
Yeah, that is definitely true. I think people are often surprised by how much is done in coalition and how many working groups there are. And many, I would say most of them are ad hoc. So there are certainly a lot of dues paying coalitions, and they're very effective and they do important work. But depending on the issue, you will see kind of different permutations of organizations gathered, and some of them are now including for-profit as well as nonprofit. And that can be a very effective combination, as Crystal has already referenced. And I think it's been interesting to see, especially in the last year, how much the public really sees the arts as one entity. So I'm not sure that the distinction between nonprofit and for-profit, which is so prevalent in our minds in DC, wearing our policy hats all the time, I'm not sure the extent to which the public necessarily sees that distinction. And sometimes that's problematic, but sometimes depending on when we're kind of getting together, it can be very, very effective to be united in pushing for common goals. So Crystal, I've heard a bit about the Creative States Coalition. I understand this is something that you might be able to speak to. Could you describe what that is and what they do?
Sure. So the Creative States Coalition is an industry association serving state level industry association and service level groups in partnership with our wonderful regional arts agencies and NASA. I think that CSC is an exciting moment in the connection between state level and federal level policy, because we're really thinking about how can we do this job differently and better than we've been doing it before. One of the things we've talked about a lot in our conversations about forming Creative States Coalition is kind of taking an ALEC-like approach to policymaking for our industry, for both investment and regulatory issues. You know, there's a lot of ways in which passing policy is easier on a state level than it is on a federal level, especially with the tenor of our politics right now. And that's why a lot of industries go state by state and blow away local people with PAC investments, or even just very little investment can pass a bill that changes things for their business on a state level. And so we've talked a lot about how can we work together to kind of draft some best practices, knowing that every state's different, every state has different combinations. But it also is just an opportunity for us to really work together with our similar colleagues. I know I've learned more every time I have conversations with people like you. And so that's one of the reasons why we've come together. And I think another thing that's exciting about Creative States in this moment is this partnership that it represents between the advocacy groups and the arts agencies. Because we definitely know when we work together, we are magic, and we can make magical things happen for this industry rather than being more siloed. And so Creative States Coalition feels like a shift in recognizing the strength of that partnership.
I'm putting you on the spot a little bit because I didn't ask you this in advance, but how long has the Creative States Coalition been around? And if people wanted to learn more about it, is there a website for it? Because unlike CAG, I mean, I'm wondering if this one is a dues paying and more formal group.
It is dues paying. The website question probably David should answer if he's chime in. I don't know if it has its own website right now. Our three co-chairs are David Holland of West Staff, my colleague Ernesto Balderas here at Utah Cultural Alliance, and then Claire Rice at Arts Alliance Illinois.
Right.
We have been having these conversations on and off for 20 years, actually, as state level industry associations, and have done different versions of this over time before and since I was in this position. But we formally created ourselves last year. So it is pretty new. It's still in its infancy, but we've done a lot of work into our structure and our work together, and we're investing in it.
Great. I know I've definitely been hearing more about the Creative States Coalition within the last year. So that tracks with the formalization of the effort. But not a surprise to hear that there are decades of conversation that lead up to that. I think that I think circling back to, what we think these efforts mean for our effectiveness as a field moving forward. I guess I would just say coalitions are as a practice, nothing new. But I think that it's been highly effective for more of these coalitions to be developing, for them to be expanding their membership, being a little bit more transparent, or a lot more transparent about what they do. And I will just say, though, that the challenge with that is, of course, the broader you are, the harder it can be to have a focus. So I think for that reason, I don't see there being a shortage of these coalitions. So what seems likely is that there will be more targeted efforts. So there already are, to some extent, a lot of these ad hoc groups that we've referenced. For example, there's one called the Performing Arts Visa Working Group. It's very, very specific. It's also a group that meets monthly. There's no letterhead for that. There's no dues, but it's a group of us that work very specifically to discuss what are the challenges and opportunities, or sort of long-running gripes, recommendations that have to do with improving visa policy. But when we band together when we sort of collect our talking points, when we confer with attorneys who are very experienced practitioners. So not only are like-minded folks who are in peer service organizations, but some people who are also working with for-profit arts petitioners and the like. It's been really helpful to kind of see what are the shared pain points that we can elevate when you can identify talking points that will appeal to both sides of the aisle, because at the end of the day, all elected members of Congress have to answer to their constituents. So when you can kind of signal what are the things that you should be looking out for, what are the stories that you can be telling your members of Congress, those have been really helpful. And working groups, task forces, whatever you want to call them, I think that that's been a very effective way of kind of aligning what our priorities are, making sure that we're all roughly reading from the same script, but allowing, I think, increasingly to some of the code switching that you had mentioned earlier, Crystal, as far as, adapt for your context, but there's should also still be an agreement of foundationally what are the common asks that we are seeking. So we might be circling back to some of these talking points that we've been mentioning before, or some of the efforts that we've sort of referenced. But our next question is, what are the major policy agendas that are emerging at the federal level that arts groups are tracking? So Tony, in addition to like our sort of standard bread and butter issues like cultural agency funding, which I think, Ryan can actually speak a little bit more to that. But I wondered if you wanted to point out other sort of federal level policy items.
Sure, Nejin, and I mentioned during my last bit of commentary about the pandemic relief legislation that was passed from March 2020 to the American Rescue Plan that was passed in or enacted in March of 2021. But Congress is also has the responsibility of passing annual funding to fund the federal government each and every fiscal year. As a result of the most recent federal government funding bill, which for FY 2022 ending September 30th, that there are significant increases across a variety of federal agencies that offer programs and resources that particularly the arts and cultural sector should be looking into and should be leveraging to provide their performances, provide public programming for their communities. And so, for example, the Small Business Administration has received a $109 million increase in this current funding bill. This is and the federal agency is going to be utilizing this increase to provide better support for minority-owned businesses and organizations, women-owned businesses and businesses and organizations, as well as provide support to rural and frontier parts of our country that have been historically underserved. Department of Labor has received a significant increase, specifically $653 million. And as you should know, they provide a whole host of federal workforce development programs that can be leveraged by individual creative workers all across the country to be able to be globally competitive, get the skill sets that they need to not only be more proficient in their craft, but also to work in other interests that they have. And so there's a variety of federal agencies that you all should keep in mind that that can touch and can benefit the arts and cultural sector. Another program that you all should be mindful of is under the American Rescue Plan that was enacted back in March of 2021, provides a $50 million nonprofit energy efficiency program. This would provide grants to nonprofit organizations so that their facilities, that they can be better energy efficient. So think HVAC systems, purchasing energy efficient windows, solar panels. These are great opportunities for organizations to be able to leverage this so that they can continue to provide health and safety environments for not only their performers and staff, but also their patrons. The other huge thing that actually was announced a few weeks ago is this White House equity initiative. And so this kind of goes back to when this current president released or signed an executive order to address equity and address and advance, break down the barriers for equitable opportunities across the federal government, and what businesses and how businesses and nonprofits organizations engage with them. So grant making, procurement, all of those services that the federal government provides. The federal government is going through, this White House is going through an initiative to address those things. And we're talking over 90 federal agencies that have released specific equity action plans, including the National Endowment for the Arts, National Endowment for the Humanities, Small Business Administration, and these action plans are going to breaking down the barriers, ensuring that those that have been historically underserved are able to have equitable opportunities to a variety of programs and resources so that they can continue to thrive in their respective sectors.
Great, thank you. I will really echo that last point as far as how much attention equity has been garnering. I think, for many groups, it's been a priority area for a long time. I would venture to say, though, for a large number of national service organizations, it has taken on more prominence than in the past within the last few years. And I think that partly it's to do with things like the White House Equity Agenda. It is also due to the expansion of groups like the Cultural Advocacy Group, because with more members as part of that ongoing monthly conversation, and you get more of a sense of, well, what matters to them, and equity matters to a lot of the state and local organizations, and they've been tremendously helpful in helping us see the opportunities to think more expansively along the equity lines. And also some of the non-arts coalitions that we've been a part of, they certainly have a very strong focus on equity and trying to improve society in a variety of ways that the arts might not necessarily immediately think to latch onto, but that we can definitely absolutely be partners to. So yeah, all of that I definitely echo. Thank you, Tony. And I would say infrastructure is sort of like the label that a lot of these will fall under. And for people who do track federal policy, we know that infrastructure was a huge part of the conversation at one point. It has had its high and low points in discussion. Despite the difficulty in getting something passed, I do think that it's fair to say that conversations are always ongoing, and there are always advocates looking for ways to sort of spin off what seems possible, what is doable on a smaller scale, what can we keep pushing for. So these are all things that I would say arts groups are still tracking, whether or not certain pieces of legislation or certain agendas, what their chances of passage will ebb and flow, but we still have a good sense of what are like long-lasting, broad implication areas that we should continue to keep an eye on. Ryan, I wondered if you could maybe speak to, I've heard you mention a little bit about messaging, the Metropolitan Group, and so on. Would you want to say a little bit more about that and how that translates to major policy agendas?
Sure. So, so the thing that you're referring to is a messaging strategy that we put out that's available on our website, which I'll also need to send a few links from our website here through. But that is work that was done through the Metropolitan Group and research into how, in actually speaking with legislators from that are conservatives or have conservative backgrounds, and speaking to the messages that resonate with conservative and independent leaning members of Congress. And so there are a number, I think, of important ways to communicate the value of the arts to the legislator or the constituents that you're speaking to. And so that is just one resource that I think is valuable for advocates who are communicating across the aisle. But I also wanted to speak here about the trends for federal legislation around cultural policy and how this also might relate to some of the things that we're seeing and that we're tracking at the state level. And that's one thing that NASA does from year to year. We track bills that are going through state houses each year. And this year we reviewed more than 1,500 bills and closely tracked 394 of them. And this, the legislation that we track has actually increased significantly in the past several years. Or legislation that we're seeing is pertinent to state arts agencies. And I think this is due partially to socially significant issues. Obviously, pandemic recovery is one thing that is driving just the volume of legislation, but also other issues such as public monuments and economic recovery. Obviously, ARP funding is something that is continuing to, or that has helped, I think, state arts agency budgets overall, but has also contributed to some significant investments from states in the arts over the past year, and we're continuing to see that. But I will also just share our legislative roundup in the chat right now, which tracks state policy and state legislation each year. And if we just think about some of those trends, I think there are some similarities to some of the bills that we've seen at least become present in Congress and at the federal level. So, I think if we look at the volume, you see that, at the state level, the circumstances and the processes are all different. But speaking about the topics that we're seeing, we see some trends in frequent types of legislation that we've seen as we've tracked over the past 7 years. And one of those things is creative economy legislation has been one of the top issue areas, at least in how we sort of track these things and categorize these things. There's been a real volume of that legislation affecting creative economy policy over the past 7 years. We also see, pandemic relief has obviously been a trend, but also attempts to advance equity and inclusion, and bills related to advancing equity have been prominent. So I think these are also things that we've observed at the federal level with recent legislation to promote creative economies and placemaking. And I think that's a positive sign for advocates, because I think we see that messaging about the creative economy and the economic value of the arts is resonating with policymakers to the point where they're sponsoring bills and bringing them to the floor and to committees. And we see that large volume. And even if the past legislation or enacted legislation is relatively few and far between, I think that's the case for any issue area or policy agenda. And I think the fact that legislators are willing to bring forward bills means that at least cultural policy and the arts are part of the conversation. So I think that is, one important positive point. I guess another thing that I would just mention is in terms of the federal agenda and NEA funding, we have seen increases most recently in the current budget, but also this administration has proposed a $23 million increase to the NEA for FY23. And so that is again showing a willingness to increase the nation's investment in the arts. And we've seen, regardless of political party, that arts funding has, at the federal level, has had some successes and increases in recent years. So I see those as positive signs.
Great, thank you so much. There's obviously a wealth of information that NASA has access to and creates and compiles. So certainly really helpful that there is an organization that is tracking what the state arts agencies are able to do and how they're sort of mirroring policy. I don't know if we said this earlier, but maybe to just repeat some knowledge that people may know is that it's not uncommon for there to be policies enacted at the state level that are sort of a testing ground for things that might have some promise at the federal level. So it is certainly a reason to keep track of what's happening in our own states, as well as what's happening federally. We certainly see that depending on how the winds shift, there are various policies that happen at state levels that can start making their way up, depending on how they're being enacted, the public reception to them, how they're playing into the current political debates that are happening. So a lot of interesting interaction and interplay between state and federal. Crystal, you had mentioned ticketing fraud earlier. Are there other major policy agendas that you see at the state level, particularly in Utah, or maybe speaking on behalf of any of your other peer state level kind of organizations?
That impact federal or
I guess just maybe that have some sort of interaction with federal level. For example, we're seeing the focus on equity playing out at the federal level. Do you see equity taking some sort of role? Has it been sort of in dialogue at the state level in Utah under that terminology, or perhaps a different terminology?
Well, definitely in Utah, we have to say opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
But it is forefront, and we talk about it all the time. And not just we in Utah, but I would say that equity is a driving reason for the creation of the Creative States Coalition, and has really driven how we've organized ourselves, how we have, and why it's a 3-person power sharing structure, and as well is kind of all with those driving issues. I mean, we've been having these conversations as an industry for a long time, and we've needed to make shifts for a long time. And at the same time, we also need significantly more investment than we have had in the past. And all of those things are tricky to balance for sure, but are so important. One thing I will add, though, is it's one thing that's really challenging, at least for me. And so I don't know if my experience speaks for everybody, but it's really hard sometimes on a state level industry association to hear about things like this program in workforce or this program in transportation, this, maybe it's title whatever in education funding has opportunities for our industry. And it's hard to know how to plug into that for our state and for our membership, for our industry as well. And that's something that we would love to have more information on, about how to kind of implement these things on different levels. And that's kind of a thing that we do with Creative States Coalition is whenever someone plugs in somewhere, we all say, okay, what did you do? What's your bill language? And NASA is a fantastic resource for that, because then we can call them and say, hey, we're exploring this issue right now. What are some other states who've run bills on this or on that topic? And NASA always has the answer. So thank you, Ryan.
Yeah, I would say one thing that we've known to be true, but I think has been coming into even sharper relief over the last couple of years, is how valuable it is to have the skill of storytelling. And, depending on the office that you talk to, there are some members of Congress and their staff who will really favor having data points, and there are others who are more moved by a narrative. And again, I realize there's going to be a session on messaging, which is great. I think that the most successful advocates are ones who are kind of equipped to do both. So they can ground their story with some data and just sort of, to use the word of 2020, to be able to pivot very quickly to whatever the need is in that moment and the tenor of the office that you're in, to being receptive to that. But that also applies to helping one another. I think being able to kind of describe, as you say, how we plug into certain opportunities, or if they're rare, maybe there's a small scale program, being able to make the most out of the few who are able to put those dollars to use. So anything that's a pilot program, there's so much value if you can be very succinct at identifying what the benefits of that are and what the opportunity to bring that to scale would be. And so I do think it's important maybe to state the obvious for those who have experience either in getting the money or putting something like a limited a grant to use in a very impactful way, to tell that story and to not be shy about sharing it, so that other people can really learn from that and pursue opportunities either at their state or local level, or work with congressional offices to maybe sponsor some legislation to expand on existing opportunities. So a lot, I guess this just comes back to the importance of being able to tell stories, communicate, identify what it is that's going to kind of, the rising tide that will lift all boats. And there are a lot of tides. So, so our next question is, to ponder, how has the pandemic propelled arts and cultural legislation, and how has it changed the policy discussions in the field as we're transitioning to a post-COVID environment? So we've already been talking about COVID to some extent. I'll just start by again sort of echoing one thing that Crystal said earlier. In terms of talking about the arts as an investment, I definitely agree that is true. I would say not just in terms of talking about economic impact numbers, things like restaurant dollars and hotel and hospitality, that is helpful and it's important, but I would say the arts need to do a better job of talking about themselves as employers as well, and arts groups of all sizes. I think it's fantastic that there's been a lot of attention on small business employers or small employers of 50 and under. I would say though, there are a lot of arts organizations that are larger than that, and one of their strengths that they should be, I think, making more of is the fact that they have a larger workforce. And certainly in this time of asking Congress for strengthened COVID support, sort of testing the waters to see, what kind of opportunities there might be to increase that support, because we're not fully out of all of this yet. Being able to talk about the impact on retaining workforce has been huge. It had Paycheck Protection Program was an absolute lifesaver for a lot of organizations, and that applied to both large and small. So I would just say, if there was one point that I would want to make, it is in being able to keep up the dialogue as far as talking about the arts as an equal partner in these sort of businessy conversations, that we contribute, but we are also employers with people who have families that they are taking care of. They are contributing to their communities. They have every bit of a need to make sure that they have stability in their jobs, as any other industry. Tony, would you like to say a little bit more about this as well? How the pandemic has propelled arts and cultural legislation, and how it's changed policy discussions as we look to a post-COVID kind of environment?
Sure. And I keep talking about funding, but it's so very important because it indicates, where the priorities are and who is prioritizing the funding, and how does that relate to support for the sector going forward. As you kind of indicated, and my colleagues kind of alluded to, is that, I think it's important for advocates to be able to talk about the intrinsic value of the sector, the creative side, also, as well as the instrumental value, so the economic impact. As you all know, there's a whole host of economic data that's out there at the federal level, state level, and the local level as well. And we should be leveraging those data points going forward as far as the number of employed, the added value add for arts and cultural goods and services. All of that is important, as well as the importance to those ancillary industries. Think transportation, construction, restaurants, and the like. And so, we are the arts and cultural sector is part of, an ecosystem that's very extensive, and it also extends to other industries. And I think that's important for your engagement and communications with your elected officials at all level. And then be able to do that, but also complement those communications with specific anecdotes and stories. How has the pandemic impacted your performances, your public programming during this pandemic? What do you foresee as we move to an endemic stage for our members? It's one of the most major concerns is just ticket sales. Their general public, their patrons are not comfortable in coming back to a public performance because of this pandemic. And so that is because of a variety of factors, the inconsistency of guidance coming from not only the federal government, but the whole environment is just changing almost daily as far as, is there a surge? Where whereas those adverse cases in a specific community. And so it's very challenging for the arts and cultural sector to be able to determine, how to go to proceed as far as having a variety of performances in public programming, knowing that the governmental environment changes almost every day. So I think, kind of going back to your question, Nedrin, is to be able to keep elected officials constantly updated with the intrinsic value, the instrumental value, complementing that with actual stories and anecdotes, and then so that their elected officials can be better informed, can make informed choices and decisions on their behalf, to be able to support the sector going forward.
Great. Ryan, same question to you. How has the pandemic propelled arts and cultural legislation? How has it changed policy discussions in the field as we transition post-COVID? Knock on wood.
Right. Easy question. So, through the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan, not to mention the SVOG, we saw historic amounts of funding allocated toward pandemic relief and recovery efforts. And this infusion, was not just for the arts sector, but the arts sector was seen as a vital part of American society, and the call for help was heeded. And I think that is also another thing that arts advocates can be proud of, that policymakers across the country from both parties acknowledge the value of the arts in a way that justified some major investments and ongoing investments. And in addition to acknowledging that the arts and culture are a worthwhile investment for relief and recovery, public agencies, including the NEA, state arts agencies, local arts agencies, along with regional arts agencies, were trusted to be part of that mechanism to get funding to communities. And I think this gives arts advocates a great opportunity to build on that trust, to demonstrate the value of publicly funded arts agencies and the importance of arts to communities. So part of that is good stewardship of the funds, along with demonstrating the impacts and outputs of those investments. So I think that's one thing that's really important, is to be able to show the utility of those investments and the impact of those investments going forward, because as we continue to go back and ask for more funding and continued funding and sustained funding, being able to demonstrate how instrumental the arts and arts organizations and publicly funded agencies were in recovery efforts, in aiding those recovery efforts, I think will be important. And so, of course, the return on investment of the funds need to be articulated in terms of dollars, cents, and economic value and jobs created. But also, as you were speaking to and Tony was speaking to, that we also need to talk about the intrinsic value of the arts. And I think we also have the opportunity to demonstrate the multi-dimensional story of the value of the arts, because many industries received funds to help, and many industries can demonstrate that we're creating jobs, there's economic output. But one thing about the arts is that there are also these other attributes and values that are attained, such as healing communities, the health benefits of the arts, the social cohesion that's created, that is all really important outside. It's all really important in healing from the pandemic, coming out of, whatever we come out of it, or whatever that actually means. As we progress, it's important for those things to, those things are also instrumental in the healing process. So those are the things that I would mention.
Great. Crystal, in our sort of preparation for this call, I know you had mentioned kind of coming up against this response of, we did enough in COVID, we want to focus on other things. Do you want to say a little bit more about that? How does one combat that? Have you started deploying any strategies when you've heard that, or maybe people who have talked about it with you? What are people sort of exchanging with each other as tactics when they come across that response?
Absolutely. The pandemic is both kind of an opportunity and door opener for our industry, but also a disruptor, because it definitely kind of made things interrupt that we were working on over time, that suddenly we had to stop and shift gears and think about survival first and foremost. But first for the opportunity, I always like to say that data opens the door, but then the heart closes the deal, right? Mm-hmm. And we can talk about our economic impacts. We can talk about our impacts as employers. We can talk about even our impacts on mental and physical health, because a lot of that is studied and documented now. But nothing makes that personally to you. But then when I can go to a legislator and say, what was your life missing in 2020? It's really easy for them to say, what my life was missing was gathering with people and enjoying a really great theater experience, or watching a dance experience, or visiting a museum. And I always say, what was your first concert like back? What was your first experience like back? And they're like, I cried. And we weren't closed that long in Utah, but they still missed it. But the challenges is our state invested early in this industry and really hands down rescued this industry with a historic $30 million investment. And in a state like ours, where public investment has been nowhere close to that forever, always, it was a lot, and it did a lot, and we did not lose any businesses. We were one of the most top 2 impacted industries, but those jobs have come back. And to such a degree that we've even struggled hiring back, because we're at a state with near zero unemployment. And because they made those significant investments, it's made it a little bit challenging for kind of the long-term work that we have been engaged on over the last several years with our state arts agency. And I think I saw my wonderful colleague Vicki along the list of the people list from Utah Division of Arts and Museums, because our state is one of the oldest arts councils, but until 3 years ago, the state itself was only spending around $1 million a year on this industry. And now it's at 7.5 over the last 3 years, plus this $30 million CARES Act investment. We had a $5 million investment last year from ARPA, and it's been hard to say, hey, we still need attention. We were trying to do something before this pandemic hit. We were trying to build a sustainable leg on our revenue stool for this industry, because this is a state that values this industry, and that's been difficult, but it's not done. I definitely, as far as the language that is shifting and that I'm finding helps us here, is when we talk about, you know, we need this investment to really scale up and to better support Utahns, to bring that magic to more Utahns, and to kind of keep that going forward. Is definitely working, but then also we have to be kind of smart about, well, we can't make the giant ask every single year, and so sometimes we have to communicate patience and expectations as well, and so it's a balance, and we're getting there. But I'm going to lunch with my cultural caucus co-chairs after this to start talking about how we keep moving along, and so we're getting there.
I'm really glad you mentioned expectations. That's been something that has been very top of mind for me. You know, we've had sort of a bumper crop as far as federal support, but I'm not, I think, saying anything people don't know when I mentioned that people are very nervous about a steep drop off in their FY23 budgets, when they will not be able to rely on this big influx of federal support. And I think that some other organizations have also sort of been having to shift a little bit to this. You know, initially there was a lot of, hey, we need you to take action, and we still do. We still want people to be taking action, but at the same time, kind of setting expectations so that they're not thinking that once in a generation funding is going to become the norm. Because that opportunity, the money just is not going to be there. And it does make, kind of returning to our pre-COVID longer term advocacy, it makes that challenging. And to kind of circle back to something Ryan said, it's critical to be able to show that we have been good stewards of the money that we've been entrusted with, and that we are not this, you know, money pit of a sector that can never get enough because we'll never be able to get back on our feet. But we need to be able to show, yes, we've had uniquely challenging circumstances. We are so happy to be coming out of this pandemic. We're still going to need some more support, and we're an important part of the sector. Our sector is an important segment of our larger economy. So there are good reasons to help us get there. But it is definitely a challenge. We have a lot of challenges ahead of us as we contemplate the post-COVID environment. Having said that, I'd like to ask my fellow panelists all here, what do you think is the top piece of legislation that advocates should be tracking and supporting? And if you want to say two, that's fine. Maybe we'll go in reverse order this time. So Crystal, then Ryan, then Tony, and then me.
Tell me you would start with me.
Oh, if you want to go last, that's fine. We can start with Ryan maybe, and then Tony, and then me, and then Crystal. Ryan, are you ready?
Sure, and I can be brief on this one, because I think what I would speak to, and what is obviously of great importance to our constituents of state arts agencies, is funding for the NEA. So that might be just a fairly straightforward way to put it, but again, you know, and as we look at funding for the NEA and for state arts agencies over the long term, the funding has been relatively flat, right? And we see that, especially for state arts agencies, that economic business cycle changes will eventually affect state government budgets, and that is largely a driving factor for how well state arts agencies are funded. And that has been the case for a very long time, up until now, I think, where we have the really vital support from the federal government for state and local governments, which I think has allowed for state arts agencies to receive a historic level of funding just recently. But for prior to this year, and really prior to 2020, state government funding for state arts agencies hasn't surpassed the peak that was in 2001 until 2020. And now, things that are happening with funding, I think, are a little hard to understand or predict, given the large infusion of federal relief and what we might be seeing in the future. But overall, I think just speaking about NEA funding, it's kind of a similar story, that after the large drop-off in 1996, there's been a steady sort of increase. And we've seen that increase under both parties, regardless of control of the House and Senate. And we're seeing that investment, at least, is being proposed to continue to increase. And so I think, again, this is a testament to advocacy and how that has worked, and the value that is perceived by the administration and members of Congress. So we all know it seems like it sometimes, we're simplifying things too much. Let's talk about NEA appropriations, but knowing that is also connected to state funding and local funding and all of the things that we do, it's really important.
Thank you. Tony.
Yeah, I concur with Ryan. It's been the funding, particularly for the NEA, has been relatively flat, but we have been seeing some progress as far as increases, particularly over the last couple of fiscal years. I included in the chat box the FY 2023 budget request coming from this administration to provide funding for the NEA has increased to $203.55 million as a proposed line item. And as our sector, of course, we're going to be advocating and urging for passage of at least that number going forward for the NEA and for the NEH, as well as increases for the other major federal arts and cultural agencies and the arts and education programs within the U.S. Department of Ed. So we have been seeing progress, and that's great for our advocates to know that their communications are working, and that is leading to some progress there. The other pieces of legislation that we're particularly focusing on as well is on the tax policy side. And so if you may or may not know, the Employee Retention Tax Credit Program, the fourth quarter credit for 2021 was eliminated to pay for the infrastructure package that was passed in November. And so a lot of our members, and I'm sure companies and organizations across the arts and cultural sector, were relying on the fourth quarter credit to be able to maintain operations, retain staff. And since that was eliminated, their actual budgets had to be readjusted, of course. But there is a legislation in the House and in the Senate. I'll include the numbers in the chat box in a second. But there is bipartisan legislation in the House and in the Senate to restore that fourth quarter credit for 2021 retroactively, if and when it's passed. Hopefully it'll get passed. But we're monitoring that, and we're advocating to urge passage there. And then there are pieces of legislation on both the House and Senate, again, bipartisan, that would increase federal incentives for charitable giving. Kind of moving forward as we get beyond this pandemic, and as the discussion was talking about, being able to sustain or compensate for this influx of funding going forward. Our members rely on generous donors, and so having increased federal incentives for donors to be able to contribute more charitable contributions, or to be able to sustain that over time. There's legislation, of course, to be able to increase those incentives over time. And then there's also other pieces of legislation to expand arts education programs. And so there's a lot of active legislation on Capitol Hill that Congress is considering right now that we're engaged in. But those three pieces of those legislation immediately comes to mind.
Yeah, I was going to say they can't all be top, Tony, but yeah, they're very important. And I will echo the tax and just say if people could keep an eye out for a possible year-end tax package, that'll be really important to just sort of see what happens after the midterms and see what Congress is in the mood to put together as far as tax policy. And I know it's something that we're already sort of bracing for and trying to sort of, line up opportunities to weigh in with members of Congress, particularly about charitable giving incentives. Crystal, have you had enough time?
Thank you. We always hear about a lot of bills like the CREATE Act, the STAR Act, that kind of comes with us with this water hose of information for state level advocates. And it's always hard to know what bills are actually moving and which exist, and they come back Congress after Congress. And I think the comment that I would add is it would be really helpful to kind of think strategically. We have all these coalitions. How are these coalitions moving policy? And where are we coming together on this policy? Because it would be great to see a federal ticketing fraud regulation. I know there's been hearings on it, but there haven't really been bills yet. And those are the kinds of things we care about. But of course, the things that we follow the most closely and work on the most are these funding bills that y'all have already talked about.
Great, thank you. So with apologies, we didn't leave quite as much time for Q&A as we had hoped, but there is still time. I think at this point, I might be handing it back to West staff to let us know if there are any questions from the audience. For those of you who have been joining us, if you have not yet asked any, I believe there is a Q&A box in this module for Eventry. So I'm assuming that's where you should be putting your questions. We'd be happy to field them. Do we have a West staffer that wants to ask us a question? If not, I've got a bonus question or two I can throw out.
While we're waiting for that, let me just remind folks and just kind of adding to Ryan and Crystal's commentary about what's going on at the state and local level. There is this the American Rescue Plan Act that was enacted back in 2021 provides $350 billion to states, local governments, and tribal governments. Governors have a lot of flexibility to utilize their federal share to support their quote unquote hardest hit industries. These are federal opportunities for our sector to be engaged and ensure that the sector gets as much support as possible, and be able to collaborate with the business community, nonprofit sector to be able to get the support from the state level. So keep that in mind. The National Conference of State Legislatures and the National League of Cities have tracking databases that track how states and local governments are utilizing their federal share. So to have that information is very useful.
Yeah, to hop onto that, Tony, I'm sorry, I don't know if you mentioned mayors just now, but that's also an important component for anyone just speaking non-federally. Advocates should definitely make sure you're still talking to your mayors about ongoing. I know we've talked about COVID a lot, but there's still relief money out there. And we know that COVID fatigue is a thing as far as advocacy goes, but it's important to make sure every last dollar that we need is being claimed. So Cynthia, hi.
Hello, everyone. Well, I wanted to give everyone a few seconds to type in their questions. My name is Cynthia. I am the manager of public policy at West Staff, she, her pronouns. I am a Asian female wearing red glasses and long curly hair. It looks like the Q&A box is empty at the moment, but I guess I can go ahead and ask you all some questions. It's great to have you all here. I think something that I've found really interesting as someone who's been watching some of this policy work happen federally, but also across the states, we've noticed that there's been an uptick in the amount of Western legislators that have been sponsoring federal policy. I don't know if any of you all might have some thoughts on that, like just thinking is this something that's specific to the West? We've seen Teresa Ledger Fernandez from New Mexico sponsoring some work recently. We've had the speakers who were in our introduction with the CREATE Acts with Senator Schatz and Bonamici and Judy Chu on all of their work. So yeah, any comments on just kind of seeing those Western lawmakers doing some work on the federal level?
Yeah, Cynthia, if I can jump in, there was recent legislation that was introduced by Representative Barbara Lee, HR 7627, HR 7627, and this is advancing equities through arts and humanities. And so this piece of legislation will provide grants to those nonprofit organizations, those community-based organizations that are led by people of color. And these would provide grants for programs that are combating systemic racism and doing this through the arts and humanities. This legislation has been recently introduced by, again, Representative Barbara Lee. We're tracking this legislation and trying to urge more representatives to support the legislation as well as to get some momentum on the U.S. Senate side. So it's great news for the sector concerning racial equity and justice.
Yeah, again, another Western lawmaker there from California. So yeah, any of the other panel, Crystal?
Yeah, I'm in the West. So I get ahead of that. I think it speaks to a couple of things. I mean, definitely the West has this entrepreneurial, creative ideas mindset. And I know with my own legislature, if I can convince them that something is new and Utah gets to lead on it, they're all in. and so I think if these Western Congress people like the idea of leading out and trying new ideas and trying different things. I think it also, I want to give a compliment to West staff on that as well, because West staff has done such a phenomenal job organizing the Western States Industry Associations into the WAN, into the Western Arts Advocacy Network, and worked with us on an individual level, helping us build our relationships with these legislators and thinking strategically about these legislators. That I think some of that shift is really due to West staff itself. Is that okay to say?
We did not script that. Thanks, Chris.
No, but it's the gosh darn truth.
I would just say, I think that the West has been well positioned and has been a proven great support for the sector. I mean, Tom Udall, when he was in office, was a longtime sponsor of, I think, the CREATE Act. And so it's really great to see that support is continuing. And it's all for the good of the sector if we can show that there isn't just one hub for arts activity. And the more spread out it is, I mean, we already know that it is. Arts take place in communities of all sizes, states, territories, localities. So the more we can show, including by sponsoring members of Congress, that it's a priority, I think it's all for the good of the sector and for our advocacy.
Sure, and I could just mention quickly that, yeah, I think I agree with all of the points. I agree that the relationships that have been built by cultural sector advocates, including West staff, are important, and the relationships that are built in different states, the relationships that Crystal has, the relationships that state arts agency leaders have with their elected officials and the federal elected officials is something that's important. There may be something about the West. I don't know. I live in Denver, so and grown up in the West, so I don't know. And I've also lived in DC on the East Coast, so my perspective doesn't really matter all that much. But I do think that there's interesting political dynamics, right, in the West, where you have a wide range of constituents that are both in rural areas, just like everywhere. There's constituents in rural areas and in more metropolitan areas, but that's especially true in the West. So I do think there's this acknowledgement of like trying to get things done in a way that's inclusive and that the value of the arts is seen as important to legislators in the West.
Yeah. And I was not paid for this comment, but I would be remiss if I didn't also call out Mike Simpson, longtime representative from Idaho, who has been, just a very outspoken supporter on behalf of our sector, and former Senator Hatch, who was a very, very long time co-sponsor for arts visa policy. So we're very thankful for the strong support that we've seen in a lot of those Western states.
And Cynthia, let me interject and I mentioned at the top of my commentary about advocacy just being a small part but important part of civic engagement. The other piece is getting involved in the elections. And so anything that our sector can do to register voters, to get out the vote, will go a long way in ensuring that we have folks in national or federal, state, and local offices that are supportive and have been historically supportive of the arts and cultural sector. And so there's things that we can do, particularly at the state and local level, to attend candidate forums, to attend town hall events, to be able to ask the right questions, and to be able to highlight and elevate the arts and cultural sector as an important part of not only the economy, but the creative landscape of local communities.
Thanks, Tony, for that comment. Well, it looks like we have one question in the chat from Christian, and kind of to end on a downer, but maybe we can try to spin it a little and say what are some threats that we see coming to the arts and culture nationally, but how can we prepare ourselves for that?
I'll take a quick stab at that, which is that especially as we are heading into an election season, this is a good time to remind people that the arts are bipartisan, they are nonpartisan. I think that there is a lot of nervousness that people feel that depending on the dynamics of Congress, the fortunes of the arts will rise or fall. But as Ryan pointed out earlier, under both administrations, we have seen pretty steady support for the cultural agencies. So I think in some ways, the looming threat to the arts is kind of in like the public. I don't want to say that we create it because, to be honest, there are some communities where, depending on your member, they might not be very supportive of a federal role for supporting the arts. But then the key there is to look for the issue that they will be supportive of. If they're not such a fan of NEA funding, they might be a fan on tax policy. So always look for the conversation where you can actually show how there is going to be a benefit to your community, and bringing it back to how your community is a contributor, how the arts are essential to the state or the congressional district, I think, and sort of grounding it in that is very helpful.
True nonpartisanship. John Cornyn from Texas, Senator John Cornyn from Texas, Senator Amy Klobuchar were initial senators that introduced legislation established to Save Our Stages program. John Cornyn from Texas, Senator Amy Klobuchar from Minnesota. True nonpartisanship.
So I would mention that I think the looming threat has been a looming threat for a very long time, whereas it has been a threat for quite some time for different parties to use the arts as a political football, right? In terms of the overall scope of government funding, we know that investment in the NEA and investment in the arts is a relatively small percentage. So any arguments that are about the not being able to afford this investment isn't necessarily coming from a truthful place. But I think the issue isn't partisan. It's about divisive politics, right? And if those that are interested in divisive politics use the art as one of their punching bags, then that is something that we have to be aware of. But I think we have, since arts advocates have been having to fight this battle for a very long time, there are lots of very solid arguments that have bipartisan support. And yeah, and I think we've been able to make that case even when those threats have come around. So I think remaining vigilant.
Well, it looks like we're 1 minute over time, but Crystal, if there's anything really quick you want to add before we wrap up and thank all of our panelists for joining us.
I think I'll just add that our threats, we've seen them before, and what's different is we are better suited as an industry to face them and turn those threats into opportunities.
That was great. Thanks for ending us on a positive note, Crystal. So on behalf of West Staff, I want to thank all of our panelists, all of you in attendance today. We're going to take a little break and then we'll hop on to session 2 this afternoon. So thank you all so much. We look forward to seeing you in future sessions. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, West Staff. Thanks, everyone.